For weeks the headlines fixated on a single, almost cinematic sequence of events. The air strikes, the sudden arrest, the image of Maduro in handcuffs. The breathless talk of oil reserves and sealed indictments. The cable news arguments over whether this was an invasion or merely an unusually muscular form of law enforcement. That phase is over now, not because it was resolved, but because it was never the real story. What we are watching unfold is something quieter, deeper, and far more consequential than the drama of one Saturday morning in Caracas. Venezuela is no longer the headline, it has become the case study. A case study in how the United States now uses power, how China chooses restraint as a strategy, and how Latin America is learning to judge both. And here is the part most analysts are missing. This operation handed China a propaganda victory without China firing a single shot. Beijing calls for law, dialogue, and sovereignty, while Washington bombs a neighbor and destabilizes a region. Venezuela was not the crisis. It was the test run, and the world has already graded it. What matters now is not simply what happened in Venezuela, but how that operation shifted perceptions across Latin America, strengthened China's diplomatic position, and revealed a fundamental transformation in how American power actually operates. This is not about personalities or ideology. It is about structure, credibility, and what happens when coercion replaces persuasion as the primary instrument of influence. To understand what is really changing, we have to move step by step from the shock of the event to the systems it activated, from the spectacle to the machinery underneath. Power in Venezuela is now being formalized through American courts. Maduro faces federal charges in New York, a move that pulls the entire situation into the U.S. judicial system and embeds it in legal frameworks that will shape every next move. But the truly decisive shift did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the international reaction. This is no longer a handful of governments issuing isolated condemnations. It is a coordinated regional response. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay issued a joint statement condemning the operation. Joint statements matter because they signal alignment and shared risk perception. They tell us that Latin American governments no longer see this as Venezuela's problem alone, but as a precedent that could apply to any of them. At the same time, the United Nations system is under visible strain. Multiple states have accused the United States of kidnapping a head of state, carrying out regime change without Security Council authorization, and violating the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force against sovereign nations. Even the UN's own independent international fact-finding mission on Venezuela stated clearly that alleged abuses by Maduro's government do not justify military intervention that breaches international law. The debate has therefore shifted from a narrow question of whether the operation was legal under U.S. statutes to a much larger and more dangerous one. Does international law have any binding force at all when a major power decides it does not? That question reverberates far beyond Venezuela. Structurally, something profound is happening. For decades, American influence rested on a foundation of alliances, institutions, and economic integration. Countries aligned with the United States not because they were forced to, but because the system it led promised stability, growth, and relatively predictable rules. That foundation is eroding, and what is replacing it is a model of economic coercion backed by the implicit or explicit threat of force. The United States now relies heavily on sanctions, asset seizures, extraterritorial court actions, energy choke points, and control over financial infrastructure. By recent counts, roughly 60% of low-income countries are subject to some form of U.S. financial sanction, and Washington imposes several times more sanctions than any other state or international body. This is not coalition building, it is pressure application. If you do not comply, you are cut off from dollar-based systems. If you attempt to bypass those systems, secondary sanctions punish anyone who does business with you. And as Venezuela demonstrates, when economic pressure fails to produce the desired political outcome, military force is no longer unthinkable. To much of the world, this does not look like leadership. It looks like coercion. It looks like threat management rather than partnership. And that perception changes how states calculate risk. If working with the United States means you could become the next target when policy priorities or domestic politics shift, why would you bind your economy and security to American-controlled systems? This is the central contradiction of contemporary American strategy. The more force and financial pressure Washington uses to maintain dominance, the stronger the incentive for others to reduce their dependence on U.S.-centric structures. This is where China enters the picture, not with troops or missiles, but with positioning. Beijing framed itself as the defender of sovereignty and international law, condemning the operation as a violation of the UN Charter and calling for dialogue and non-interference. That framing resonated across Latin America because the contrast was stark. China builds ports, railways, and power plants in the region. The United States bombs a neighbor. China offers loans, trade agreements, and infrastructure. The United States threatens tariffs, sanctions, and now military action. This is not an argument about virtue. China has its own long record of coercion and control. But in this specific contest, in this specific region, China succeeded in appearing as the predictable, stable partner, while the United States looked volatile and aggressive. When Brazil's president described the operation as a grave affront to sovereignty and a dangerous precedent, when Colombia's leader said conflicts must be resolved peacefully by the people themselves, when Mexico cited a clear violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, these were not marginal voices. They were signals from major regional powers that their trust in American restraint has eroded. The attempt to intimidate rivals ended up advertising China's alternative model, because every country in the global South is now asking a simple question. If the United States can do this to Venezuela, what stops it from doing it to us when we make decisions Washington dislikes? In the Western Hemisphere, this marks a shift from partnership to skepticism. The Venezuela operation fits into a broader pattern of threats and pressure directed at Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, Panama, and others over migration, trade, security, and strategic assets. Venezuela is the proof that these are not empty threats. They can escalate. As a result, governments across Latin America are recalculating assumptions that held for generations. The old logic said alignment with the United States brought security guarantees and economic opportunity. The new calculation compares two imperfect options: Chinese economic engagement that is transactional but predictable, versus American power that offers access to the world's largest economy, but comes with shifting demands, political conditionality, and the risk of sudden coercion. China signs long-term contracts and largely ignores domestic governance. The United States demands alignment on foreign policy, trade rules, and increasingly internal political choices. For states that have already experienced U.S. pressure, predictability is becoming more valuable than rhetoric about shared values. That alone represents a strategic loss for Washington that will take years, if not decades, to reverse. Oil remains central to this story, but not in the simplistic way it is often framed. Venezuela's vast reserves matter less for current output than for future control and currency denomination. For half a century, oil has been priced primarily in dollars, creating constant global demand for U.S. currency and allowing the United States to finance deficits cheaply. That system is now fracturing. Energy trades are increasingly settled in local currencies. Saudi Arabia has loosened its exclusive dollar arrangements, and Venezuela had begun selling oil to China in yuan through Chinese payment systems. The true threat was not Venezuela's current production level, but the demonstration that large-scale oil trade outside the dollar system is viable. Remove the government, reassert dollar pricing, and you slow that trend. Yet the irony is unavoidable. China builds infrastructure while the United States creates crisis. To oil-producing states watching closely, the lesson may be that selling to China is safer precisely because China does not invade you if you change partners. The operation may secure short-term leverage, but it accelerates the long-term movement toward non-dollar energy systems. Legally and institutionally, the damage is even deeper. The UN Charter's prohibition on unilateral force is supposed to be the cornerstone of global order. When the United States violates it and responds to criticism with indifference, it strips its own arguments of moral force. If rules apply only when convenient, they cease to be rules at all. This was not merely another round of pressure on a hostile government. It was direct military action and the forcible removal of a sitting head of state. That sets a precedent, and precedents are contagious. If international law does not restrain Washington, why should it restrain Moscow or Beijing? The credibility collapse is systemic. The UN depends on great powers at least pretending to follow the rules. When that pretense disappears, legitimacy erodes and power alone fills the void. Power without legitimacy is unstable. Beneath all of this lies the momentum of institutions that benefit from conflict. Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex feels less like history and more like diagnosis. Decisions of enormous consequence are increasingly made within an executive security apparatus with limited democratic oversight, vast budgets, and incentives that favor action over restraint. Congress was not meaningfully consulted before the Venezuela operation. Emergency authorities and executive powers have expanded to the point where military action can reshape foreign relations without public debate. This is not about one administration. It is about a structural drift that carries costs measured in lost trust, hedging allies, and fading soft power. For Americans, including those nearing or in retirement, these shifts are not abstract. Energy prices, dollar stability, bond values, and the long-term funding of pensions and social programs are all tied to global confidence in U.S. systems. There is also a moral cost. Many grew up believing the United States stood for law and restraint. Watching that image erode is unsettling in ways that spreadsheets cannot capture. The central strategic question, still largely unasked, is whether the United States has entered an era where coercion replaces persuasion and threats substitute for alliances. Venezuela suggests that it has, and while China's approach is hardly benevolent, it is proving effective in a world increasingly wary of unpredictability. In the end, Venezuela will not be remembered for Maduro or the raid or the indictments. It will be remembered as the moment perceptions shifted, when the United States lost moral ground and China gained diplomatic space, when Latin America stopped assuming American restraint. The operation may achieve its immediate goals, but history will remember the structural turn it revealed. It will remember the shift, and that shift is quietly redefining what American power means in the 21st century.